It has so much history and significance for the German nation. This vital waterway has always been a romantic location, inspiring poets and writers to create a national identity.
Die Rheinromantik spielte eine große Rolle. Es war eine nationale Katastrophe im Bewusstsein vieler, wenn es dem Feind gelang, den Rhein zu überschreiten. Denn dann fragte man sich, wo sollte denn dann wohl noch die Möglichkeit bestehen, sich zu widersetzen, wenn nicht hier.
In March 1945, the river itself became the front line. For invading Allied troops, it was the last natural obstacle to Berlin, just as it had been for Napoleon's army 140 years earlier. More than 1 million soldiers were to cross the river, taking the war deep into Hitler's empire, back to Berlin, where it had originated. This was the Battle of the Rhine, the last act in the liberation of Europe.
It was a necessary operation before we could win the war. We had to cross the Rhine, we had to get substantially into Germany and defeat the Germans on their own ground.
Seen here after its destruction, an insignificant railway bridge at Remagen unexpectedly became the Allies' focus. The bridge was to save many lives, but it proved the undoing of this German officer. This was the largest air-land operation of the war. An armada of Allied bombers and gliders supported American and British soldiers on the ground. Meanwhile, German cities continued to bear the brunt of Allied bombs. Dresden, Würzburg, Pforzheim. This was the final push in a war against fanaticism, when Hitler's defense was symbolized by boy soldiers. Did Allied soldiers view themselves as victors or liberators?
Certainly didn't feel like a liberator. I had a feeling of bitterness toward the nation as a whole, the people as a whole. I had a personal feeling of bitterness about that. And the fact that we couldn't trust 12-year-old boys because they were trained and indoctrinated as Hitler Youth, you know. So at the time, at the end of the war, you don't feel like you're liberating anyone. You know, you're just glad it's over with and we beat them, that's all. That's the honest, that's the gut feeling, the inner feeling.
The first German town to be captured, Aachen, to the west of the Rhine, had fallen 5 months previously in October 1944. One American officer in Aachen was Saul Padover, an Austrian-born Jew. Working as an intelligence officer, his task was to report on the mindset of the conquered Germans. Reporting the opinions of a German estate agent, Padover noted,
"He admits that he heard of the atrocities which the Germans were committing against Poles and Jews. However, the Germans, he says, were innocent. The generals, he said, were not to blame either. They are professional soldiers, not politicians. They carry out orders, he said. Even the business people who supported Hitler are not to blame either. We are all innocent, he said. You must not punish the German people."
Padover felt like an anthropologist, entering the territory of an unknown tribe. But had this tribe been conquered or liberated?
Ich bin besiegt worden. Ich bin besiegt worden und das hat vielleicht so ein Jahr bis 1,5 Jahre gedauert, bis das eben auch alle Sachen rauskamen, die passiert sind, Holocaust und so weiter. Und dann kam dann der totale Umbruch, also auch in der Meinung, wie verkehrt das alles war und wie schlimm das alles war. Ne? Aber erst habe ich mich nicht befreit gefühlt. Ich nicht. Viele mit Sicherheit, aber ich nicht.
Posters urged the German people not to give up. And throughout the whole Reich, its very last forces were being mobilized, including children and the elderly. Newsreels continued to proclaim the certainty of victory. Reality had deserted Germany.
Vertreter des Volkes, andererseits aber auch als Vertreter dieser meiner rheinischen Heimat, der ich mich auch heute noch zugehörig fühle, vor der Nation und vor der ganzen Welt zu erklären, dass wir dieses Gebiet niemals aufgeben werden und es verteidigen werden wie eine Festung bis zum letzten Atemzug.
These pictures depict another fortress, East Prussia, which had been invaded by the Red Army. Reports of Russian atrocities swept westwards across to the Rhine. By February 1945, Stalin's troops reached the River Oder in the east. Meanwhile, the armies of the Western Allies advanced on the Rhine. The main fighting was to be conducted in the north, near Wesel. As protection on their flank, the Americans were advancing in the south to Oppenheim, near Mainz. A further army marched towards Cologne and Bonn. The Germans had determined to blow up the Rhine bridges, which offered them the last possibility of retreat. The bridge commandant at Remagen was 32-year-old Major Hans Scheller, who was married with 2 children. He was well aware that the war was lost and that further fighting was pointless.
Wir sprachen alle nicht darüber. Meine Schwäger waren beide Offiziere und von meiner Schwägerin, ihr Mann war auch Offizier. Das waren Tabus. Wir hatten alle Angst. Angst um unsere Männer, Angst um die Situation.
The American First Army approached the bridge at Remagen and by the 6th of March was only a few kilometers away. To their surprise, the Americans were encountering only weak German resistance. Even the bridge itself was defended by just a few soldiers, none of whom wished to sacrifice themselves for a position which couldn't be held much longer. The headquarters of the commandant was inside a bridge pillar. One of the air defense team was on duty as a telephone operator. He overheard a conversation to one of his superiors.
Um die Mittagszeit klingelte das Telefon, Heil Hitler Pratke. Ich habe eine Meldung, Amerikaner bei Rheinbach durchgebrochen. Mit Vorstoß auf Bonn und Remagen ist zu rechnen. Brücke ist mit Zündung zu sprengen vorzubereiten. Heil Hitler, Herr Friesenhahn, Heil Hitler, Herr Pratke. Da war für mich klar, jetzt kommt der Krieg unmittelbar zu dir.
By the 7th of March, men in units of the 9th US Tank Division were setting off from Meckenheim just south of Bonn in the direction of Remagen. Little could they have guessed what was in store this historic day. Within a few hours, they would be hailed as heroes.
So our mission was to go to the Rhine and then turn south and go along that and clear that edge over there. It had nothing to do with, nothing in the orders that we received had to do with capturing a bridge.
Around noon, soldiers of the 9th US Tank Division reached a bank above Remagen. They were met with an unexpected sight. The bridge had still not been destroyed.
I can remember seeing people running, soldiers and civilians going across the bridge, German soldiers and German civilians crossing the bridge, and at the other side of it, it was a high hill and the railroad tracks went through a tunnel. And so it was a good view of that from where we were over there.
Commandant Major Scheller had hesitated to blow up the bridge because German soldiers were still retreating across it. Around 2:30 p.m., he and his men fled into the railway tunnel on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Also in the tunnel were hundreds of civilians hoping for protection. Men, women, and children praying for a quick end to the fighting. Only a few soldiers remained in position on the bridge.
Dann habe ich mich oben hingestellt und mal geguckt, wie sieht es dann am Rheinufer aus. Und das ist auch ein Bild, was ich nie vergessen werde. Auf einmal kam ein amerikanischer Soldat von der letzten Straße, die heute noch ist, in Remagen, in Richtung Brücke und ging allein mit seinem Gewehr im halben Anschlag an einer Mauer vorbei, Schritt für Schritt, sichernd. wenn so sein, so 200, 250 Meter und nichts passiert. Das habe ich mir alles angeguckt. Und dann stand ein erster amerikanischer Panzer direkt neben der Brücke auf der Remagener Seite. Da wusste ich, jetzt Heinrich, wird's Zeit, jetzt musst du abhauen.
3:20 p.m. The first Americans were preparing to storm the bridge. In the tunnel on the other side, Major Scheller gave the order to blow it up.
Da sagte der Sprengmeister, der etwas geduckter stand und ich stand hoch, dann hatte mich immer schönsten rheinischen Platt gefragt, Litze, Litze, das heißt auf der Hochdeutsch Lichtze. Dann habe ich gesagt, nee. Und dann hat er das gesagt, was Leute dann in solchen Situationen zu sagen pflegen. Scheiße.
The fuse had failed. Then a second attempt also failed. The bridge at Remagen was still there. The Americans were amazed. A task force was dispatched. The first Americans on the bridge were Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, born in Frankfurt, Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a butcher from Ohio, and Lieutenant Hugh Mott from Nashville, Tennessee.
After the infantry had taken the town of Remagen, the task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Engelman, called me up and ordered me out on the bridge to do some reconnaissance. I was to find out what demolitions were on the bridge and if the bridge would take traffic, and if not, how long it would take to repair the bridge for traffic.
There wasn't a whole lot of firefighting, really, that first afternoon there. And in fact, the firing was a little firing here and there, and you was asking about a feeling you had. When you went out on that bridge, it just felt like they just laying back there in the shadows saying, come on, baby. Come on across here, and we'll get you and the bridge both at the same time. You know, that's the kind of feeling that you had.
Amazingly, the bridge was taken without a fight. The Americans could hardly believe their luck. A Rhine bridge in one piece. One general declared that it was worth its weight in gold. Meanwhile, Major Scheller, requesting reinforcements, had fled. The atmosphere in the tunnel had turned to one of fear. The fear of foreign troops and, a further deadly risk, a train loaded with petrol.
Wir waren uns überhaupt nicht der Gefahr bewusst, den die Wagen, die dort standen, für uns bedeutet haben. Ich sagte, ein Schuss rein, war alles zu Ende. Und der Veltens, der Willy Veltens, der hat das scheinbar auch sofort erkannt und der ist dann rausgelaufen mit einer weißen Fahne.
A railway worker named Willy Feldens had sought protection in the tunnel with his mother, his wife Maria, and son Karl. Determined to surrender to the American soldiers personally, Willy ran towards the tunnel exit with a white flag.
Später kam dann ein Erbler zu uns und sagte, der Willy, der ist verwundet, also mein Vater. Und wir liefen dann zum Eingang und da lag der am Boden. Mein Vater sagte, mir ist es kalt, und da hat meine Mutter versucht, Decken zu bekommen und hat sich daneben gelegt, für zu wärmen.
A shot through the wallet had fatally wounded Willy Feldens. Nevertheless, he'd achieved his aim. The remaining civilians and soldiers were able to leave the tunnel unharmed. But the wounded Willy and his wife Maria stayed behind. She recorded the day's events in her diary.
A terrible night, no doctor to help. My dear little wife, help me, he repeated again and again. But how could I help? He died at 5:30. I feel terrible when I realize that I have lost my one and all. He will no longer be able to say, my darling, no more, my dear little wife. Now we're going home, alone again, a bleak time ahead.
One of the bystanders asked the Americans why Feldens had been shot.
Sag ich, er ist ein Soldier, er ist kein Soldat. Der ist von der deutschen German Railways, er ist von der deutschen Eisenbahn. Und dann habe ich ihm gesagt, they have black uniforms. Die haben auch schwarze Uniformen. Hat er geguckt. Nachher haben sie mir gesagt, sie hatten ihn für einen SS-Mann gehalten.
By sheer luck, a Rhine bridge had fallen intact into American hands. Hitler was furious. He ordered the bridge to be bombed so that even if the Germans failed to win it back, it would collapse. But it was too late. The Americans had sent all their available forces over the Rhine. Within 24 hours of taking the bridge, there were already some 8,000 GIs on the river's east bank. The German line was falling apart.
Not exhilaration, because we didn't recognize the value of that at the time. Your job is to do something, and you don't stop to say, well, is it a valuable mission? Is it meaningful? You don't learn until years later that we were the first ones to cross since the time of Napoleon. But you don't know that when you're in the combat, see? So.
On the 17th of March, 10 days after it had been taken, the damaged bridge at Remagen collapsed. But the Americans had long since stabilized their bridgehead. The taking of the bridge was a catastrophe for Hitler. He looked for someone to blame and personally set up a court-martial to set an example. Major Scheller, the last bridge commandant, was the first to be caught in the claws of Nazi justice. Field Marshal Mödel, the commander-in-chief of Army Group B, arrested him personally. In a house near Rumbach in the Westerwald forest, Scheller was brought for court-martial on the 13th of March. He was sentenced to death the same day. Colonel Reichhelm, an officer on Mödel's staff, was present at the proceedings.
Man muss sich so vorstellen, dass der Hitler schon jemanden ausgesucht hat, der in seinem Sinne ein Urteil fällen wird. Also man konnte von vornherein davon ausgehen, irgendein Schuldiger, wenn nicht 2, 3, 4, 5 Schuldige, werden gefunden werden.
The sentence was carried out later that day in the woods near Rimbach. Major Hans Scheller was executed by firing squad. Another pointless death. Scheller was the father of 2 children, with a third on the way. His heavily pregnant wife, Liesel, heard the news on the radio.
Mittags um 2 bei den Nachrichten, den Militärnachrichten. Da wurde es gesagt, dass er wegen Feigheit vor dem Feind und Dienstverweigerung hingerichtet worden wäre, verurteilt und hingerichtet worden. Das Urteil wäre bereits vollstreckt.
In all, 20,000 German soldiers were sentenced to death and executed during the war. The majority, like Hans Scheller, during the last year of fighting. March 1945. Almost the whole west bank of the Rhine north of Remagen lay in Allied hands. In Cologne, danger still lurked in the ruins. Fanatical Hitler youths celebrated by the German media.
Ein kleiner deutscher Junge von 12 Jahren habe einen kanadischen Soldaten im Kauderwelsch angebettelt und von diesem Kanadier Schokolade erbeten. Ich kann mir so richtig vorstellen, wie der gesagt hat, hallo Boy, hier Schokolad nicht. Und der kanadische Soldat habe sich, wie Reuter meldet, leider beeinflussen lassen von dem Bitten des deutschen Jungen und habe in seinen Taschen nach Schokolade gesucht. Und in diesem gleichen Augenblick habe der kleine Junge die Pistole gezogen und dem Kanadier in den Bauch geschossen. Das wäre die deutsche Jugend verkommen und verwahrlost. Ich kann nur sagen, Hunderttausende solche Jungs und der Krieg ist in Kürze zu unseren Gunsten entschieden.
Fighting behind Allied lines, the so-called werewolves were featured in German propaganda. Many of these boy soldiers were operating until the end, as Lieutenant Dmitri Paris found out.
it's only some radical. We had one man killed by a junior kid. He didn't suspect him. A kid suddenly raised up and he had a bazooka and fired it. And some radical, you know. Hitler Youth had been inspired to fight for the homeland. But normally, that would be the exception to the rule. Normally, when the white flags came out, you knew it was pretty safe to proceed through there. And because if there were armed men around there, they wouldn't dare put out the white flag, or they'd be shot by their own soldiers, you see. So you felt pretty sure there were no soldiers around, or no SS or SA or anything like that. If they felt safe enough to put out a white flag, we felt safe enough to ride through their town, say it that way.
The British war reporter Alan Moorhead recorded his experiences in Cologne.
There was something weird about the atmosphere surrounding the ruins of Cologne, something that you could not comprehend. A town means hustle and bustle, noise and people, not quiet, emptiness and silence, a kind of cemetery silence. And the towers of the cathedral, like a miracle still pointing to the sky, make the debacle even more ghostly. The expanse of ruins lay in the light of the morning sun and seemed so realistic, as if the town had never looked any other way.
American intelligence officer Saul Padover also kept a record of the newly liberated towns and the reactions of their inhabitants.
One teacher said to me, he said, "I would like to give you a piece of friendly advice. One day," he said, "you Americans will notice that you have chosen the wrong allies. The Russians aren't really a nation, but a mixture of many different races. You will never get on with them. But your biggest mistake is the English. They're hard, they're cynical, they're selfish. You Americans don't understand Europe."
But the majority of Germans in the West were relieved to have been liberated by the Americans rather than the Russians.
Wie die unsere Ahornstraße runterfuhren und mit den Panzern da runterfuhren, auch mit Jeeps. Und da standen ja auch schon Kinder an den Straßen und denen warfen sie auch schon mal Kaugummi, ich weiß nicht, was es war, oder vielleicht auch Schokolade. Und an diesen Reaktionen konnte man dann ja auch schon merken, dass es dann wohl nicht ganz so schlimm sein wird.
This film footage shows a temporary reprieve from the misery of war. An interlude before the misery of peace yet to come. A first taste of the American way of life. For Americans and Germans were still strangers to one another. The collapse of the bridge at Remagen could not stop the Allied advance. American tanks crossed the River Rhine on their own pontoon bridges. They rolled past the remnants of a German army in retreat, past scenes of devastation in a country that they had come to defeat and liberate. Within a week of taking the Remagen Bridge, some 25,000 American soldiers had crossed the Rhine. For the persecuted in Hitler's Reich, their appearance meant
Hoffnung. Das war die Frage, ob sie noch zeitig kommen. Und sie kamen ja da eben durch diese Geschichte mit der Brücke früher als erwartet, hinter unserem Haus ging die Autobahn. Und da kamen wir, da hörten wir die, wie sie kamen. Und darum ist mein Vater dem ja entgegengegangen.
Out of fear of being arrested, the Grüters family had moved from Cologne to a village near Limburg, east of the Rhine. As a half-Jew, according to Nazi racial laws, Veronica's father had lived in fear of arrest and deportation.
Ich habe aus dem Fenster geguckt und mein Vater ging dem ersten Offizier entgegen. Und der kam natürlich mit Angst ins Dorf, weil er nicht wusste, was die da erwartete. Und mein Vater ging ihm entgegen und hätte ihn am liebsten umarmt und abgeküsst. Das war die Befreiung, hat er ja ersehnt, dass sie noch rechtzeitig käme. Und der Offizier aber hatte Angst und nahm seine Pistole und hielt sie meinem Vater minutenlang vor die Brust. Und ganz langsam senkte dann der Offizier der Armee, wir sagten die Amis, seine Pistole und dann haben sie sich verständigt.
Meanwhile, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing for the main attack on the Lower Rhine near Wesel. He planned to cross the Rhine with more than 1 million soldiers. To cover the attack, the river's west bank was pumped with artificial fog. Under the protection of a gigantic cloud of oil and water, British troops and equipment were moved up to the river. Despite their superior numbers, some Allied soldiers remained skeptical.
I thought that there was going to be a lot of resistance. I thought that this was the ideal place for them to throw us back into the Rhine and to ensure that we couldn't get a crossing. But as you say, the fall of the Rhine-Magen Bridge might have had a considerable effect from the enemy point of view, because it wouldn't be so vital for them to throw us back.
– 5 p.m. on the 23rd of March, 1945. More than 1 million soldiers were preparing to attack. With a barrage consisting of over 1,300 guns, the major assault on the Rhine began. German defensive positions on the far bank were their targets. Four hours later, as part of Operation Turnscrew, the first soldiers of the 51st British Highland Division crossed the Rhine near Ries. By the following morning, all 3 of the division's brigades were over, despite resistance from German troops in the town. The river's east bank at this point was finally cleared on the afternoon of March the 25th. The plan was for the British to draw level with the Americans, who'd already crossed to the south near Remagen. On their march to Berlin, the Rhine was the Western Allies' last major obstacle.
There was a terrific feeling of competition, and that we had to get over the Rhine, and that somebody was going to report back before anyone else that they'd taken their objectives on the other side.
To support his ground troops, Montgomery had organized the largest combined air-land operation of the Second World War. On the morning of the 24th of March, 2 divisions of paratroopers set out from England and France. Their job was to weaken German resistance behind the Rhine front, in support of advancing Allied units on the ground.
He was told that this operation was based on mistakes made on D-Day, which was the night drop, and at Arnhem, where they dropped the troops too far from the objective, which gave the enemy that much time to prepare for defenses.
This time, it would be different. British, Canadian, and American paratroopers were dropped during daylight and right on target in the operational area. Charles Harding's battalion was the first to jump. He landed in a field near Burgerfurt at 9:51 a.m. A company of the German paratroop Hunter Regiment 7 had established itself in the adjacent woods. There was bitter hand-to-hand fighting. Harding and his comrades were united in their determination to clear out the enemy.
The men were angry, having lost a well-respected company commander and the platoon commander, and I'm afraid there wasn't very many prisoners. I'm sorry to say this, it's funny.
No German survivors are known. 25 soldiers of the company are still missing. But the British also suffered heavy losses.
at the end of that wonderful March, sunny day, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, our division had lost 1,500 chaps, killed or wounded. Very few were missing because you couldn't miss much.
11 a.m. on the 24th of March, 1 hour after the paratroopers had landed, the second wave was approaching. 1,300 paragliders bringing supplies, soldiers, and equipment to the front line. A suicide squad. The slow gliders were easy targets for the German flak, and many pilots preferred to risk a crash landing. Medical orderlies arriving with the reinforcements took care of the wounded on both sides. The unpleasant face of war was part of everyday life for these soldiers. The commander of the 3rd Parachute Brigade, General James Hill, reflected on his mother's words.
My mother, in 1939, when I went to the war, sent for me, and she was a very good and spiritual lady, the wife of a distinguished soldier. And she said, "Now, darling, if you survive this war, you've got to learn to harden your heart." And of course, that's what you had to do. You had to get used to seeing all these things.
He had expected the battle for the Rhine to be harder fought. The following day, Winston Churchill crossed the Rhine. The German defenses near Wesel had collapsed. The Prime Minister said to Eisenhower, "My dear General, the Germans have been beaten. Now we have them. They are finished now." From their bridgeheads near Remagen and Wesel, Allied troops marched eastwards. The industrial region of the Ruhr had not been conquered, but surrounded. On the 1st of April, the ring closed near Lippstadt. German Army Group B, with more than 300,000 soldiers, was caught in the biggest cauldron on the Western Front. The staff of their Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Model, was under no illusions as to their prospects.
Wenn Sie die Amerikaner gesehen hätten, mit was für Material die ankamen. Also das war wie, wenn ein reicher Mann gegen einen in 8 Jahre im Gefängnis oder 6 Jahre im Gefängnis sitzenden Halbkranken kämpft.
The German soldiers did not have sufficient supplies, food or hope. So why did they keep on fighting against this superpower?
Das kommt alles zusammen, das ist dann eine Mischung aus Vaterland, aus Eid, aus Pflichtbewusstsein, aus Beharrungsvermögen, wie sie es nehmen wollen. Weiß ich, kann man sich in uns da gar nicht mehr hineinversetzen, wie wir da in dieser letzten Phase immer noch gekämpft haben.
Hitler issued his infamous scorched earth order, the Nero Decree. All transport and communications facilities, industrial establishments and supply depots were to be destroyed before they could fall into Allied hands. The German people had gambled away their right to live, said Hitler. This destructive order was ignored by the Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B, Walter Model, though for him too there was only victory or defeat, regardless of the cost. He ordered his officers to fight as fanatical National Socialists, as examples to their men. He said there was no doubt about victory. His first General Staff Officer knew what he had in mind.
Seinem ganzen Stab ist klar gewesen, dass Model nicht in Gefangenschaft gehen wird. Dass, wenn es eben zu Ende ist, seinem Leben ein Ende bereiten wird. Entweder, dass an die Front geht und sich erschießen lässt, oder dass sich selber erschießt.
At Hitler's request, Colonel Reichhelm was flown from the Ruhr cauldron to Berlin to give the Führer a first-hand account of Army Group B's desperate situation. The district around the Reich Chancery was deserted. Berlin was a ghost town. Hitler rarely ventured from the so-called Führer bunker under the Chancellery. Each day, he called in his closest colleagues for a briefing.
Zum Schluss kam Hitler, der am ganzen Leibe zitterte. Und heute weiß ich, dass er Parkinson mit Sicherheit gehabt hat. Und auch in der dann folgenden Besprechung hat er zitternd an dem Lagentisch gestanden und gegenüber Hitler auf dem großen Lagentisch saß Göring, der sich die Karten über den Kopf gezogen hatte, weil er offensichtlich unter Drogen stand und schlief. Und Hitler hat sich das gefallen lassen. Also für mich war das wie in einem schlechten Märchen, das Ganze.
This, some of the last known footage of Hitler shot on the 19th of March, hints at his weariness.
Als ich ihm die aussichtslose Lage im Ruhrkessel geschildert habe, erstens dachte ich, Hitler würde mich anbrüllen oder irgend so etwas Ähnliches, dass man nicht aufgeben darf oder so etwas Ähnliches. Nein, er war in diesem Moment ganz in sich gekehrt und sagte so mehr zu sich selber, der Model war mein bester Feldmarschall. Als ich dann mit der Besprechung fertig war und mir ein Stein vom Herzen fiel, dass er endlich kapiert hat, dass der Krieg im Ruhrkessel zu Ende ist, begann er, Hitler, mit erhobener Stimme, die Heeresgruppe B darf nicht untergehen, sie muss entsetzt werden und die Rheinfront muss wieder aufgebaut werden. Da habe ich gedacht, der Kerl ist verrückt geworden. Mit was für Kräften eigentlich?
Germany's remaining defense now rested on the Hitler Youth and old men. But the will to fight was dwindling among the German soldiers. The end was near, and they knew it.
Wir haben gekämpft, aber keine Hoffnung mehr gehabt. Sagen wir so. Nicht mehr gehofft, dass jeder hat gehofft, dass er wieder nach Hause kommt, dass mir nichts mehr passiert. Und so haben wir uns auch verhalten. Also wir waren keine Kämpfer mehr.
Only the youngest still believed in victory. Yet they were fighting for a regime that willingly sacrificed them simply to stave off the inevitable for a few more days.
Es war das Gefühl, dass wir alle unser Vaterland retten müssten. Man muss schon davon ausgehen, dass zu der Zeit die Städte zerstört wurden. Die Bomben fielen Tag und Nacht aufs Ruhrgebiet. Und man wusste, wie viel Opfer das mit sich brachte. Und wir hatten zu der Zeit nicht das Gefühl, dass die Bomber, die über uns kreisten, unsere Freunde sind. Das waren schon zu der Zeit noch unsere bitteren Feinde.
More and more German soldiers surrounded in the Ruhr were surrendering, ending the hopeless battle. Word had got round that the Americans were treating prisoners well. No one wanted to risk their lives at the last moment.
On the way back, I'm walking back all alone with one man with me. And he said, "Now, sir, you were telling us the other day what we say if we're trying to get these German soldiers to give up." I said, "All right, now let's presume there's some German soldiers in the woods here to my left." Here's what I say, and I spun around and say, "Kommen Sie hierher, kommen Sie aus dem Gebüsch, kommen Sie Hände auf den Kopf, kommen Sie hierher." I was about to turn back and say, "That's how you do it." And he said, "Ja, we're coming." And I turned around and looked, and out of the woods comes a whole battalion staff, all with schmeisers and everything else around their neck. And inadvertently, I'd taken a whole about 30 guys prisoner.
The will to fight was finally broken. In some places, advancing Allied soldiers received a hearty welcome. Liberators and liberated made attempts to approach each other. The population was relieved, an end to the battles and the bombing. The last German tanks drove through the streets with white streamers. Field Marshal Model had to admit that the battle was over, but he did not want to surrender. On the 16th of April, he issued his last order.
Die Heeresgruppe B ist aufgelöst. Sie sind alle aus der Wehrmacht entlassen. Sie können nach Hause gehen, wenn Sie wollen. Sie können auch hier bleiben. Auf jeden Fall, die Einheit gibt's nicht mehr.
A trick to avoid a formal surrender. The outcome was the same. This rare footage shows German soldiers in Iserlohn as they laid down their weapons. Captain Albert Ernst handed over his unit. The staff officers allowed themselves to be taken. Among them, Heinz Günther Guderian, son of Hitler's legendary tank general. What was he thinking at this moment?
Nächstes Mal natürlich niedergeschlagen, das ist schon mal klar. Dann ist man froh, dass Schluss ist. Das ist irgendwo ja doch dann ein Gefühl des Erleichtertseins. Und dann ist man eben gespannt, wie geht das nur weiter. Und das ging dann sehr, sehr bald wenig erfreulich weiter. Nicht?
Lieutenant Colonel Guderian was taken to a camp near Remagen. The Americans were having problems taking care of the great mass of prisoners who had to camp outside with no roof over their heads. 1,200 of the 300,000 prisoners in Remagen died in the camp. The woods south of Duisburg. Model had once said to his son that a field marshal did not allow himself to be captured. That was just not possible. He shot himself on the 21st of April 1945. A man who believed himself disgraced not by war, but by defeat. Why didn't he surrender?
Ich meine, wenn einer den Krieg hätte beenden können, wäre es der Feldmarschall Model gewesen. Aber er war zu preußisch, er war zu wenig politisch ausgerichtet, als dass er diesen Entschluss gefasst hätte. Er hat ihn wohl als Preuße gefasst, indem er sich zum Schluss das Leben genommen hat, weil er gesagt hat, ich muss mit meiner Heeresgruppe untergehen. Aber natürlich hätte er können an der Grenze sagen, bis hier und nicht weiter, und ich entlasse meine Soldaten. Wäre möglich gewesen, er hätte sich am Rhein das Leben nehmen können. Das wäre möglich gewesen.
The war in the West had been decided with the Battle of the Rhine and the encirclement of the Ruhr. On their advance, Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps and discovered evidence of unimaginable atrocities. On the 25th of April, Soviet and American soldiers met at Torgau near the River Elbe. They celebrated the union of the Western and Eastern fronts. This signaled the liberation of more than 3 million foreign force labor workers and prisoners of war in the western zones of occupation alone. The majority of German soldiers were captured. Almost every second German was on his way to a POW camp at the end of the war or fleeing. 14 million people lost their homes forever. The struggle now was simply one of daily survival. And for most, it was too soon to take in the full impact of what had befallen them.
Der Krieg ist zu Ende. Wir haben es überlebt. Das war die Grundstimmung. Also, wenn ich überlege, dann kamen am 11. März die Amerikaner hier nach Leubsdorf. Das war die Grundstimmung. Der Krieg ist zu Ende, Gott sei Dank. Die ganze Debatte, sind wir besiegt worden? Sind wir befreit worden? Für diese Gedanken hatte man erst Zeit, als alles vorbei war.
For 7 months, the American intelligence officer Saul Padover studied the liberated Germans. Having completed his mission, he left the country, which still, for him, resembled the territory of an unknown tribe. In his last report, he wrote,
"There was fear, death, and desperation in Germany. The Germans weren't interested in peace. They'd been defeated, beaten. And in a certain way, they were relieved that the nightmare was finally over. They were an unwanted people. Only the future generation of Germans will be able to create a new beginning. One must hope and pray that they succeed."
At the beginning of May, American soldiers occupied Hitler's mountain retreat. The dictator was dead, his 1,000-year Reich at an end.
Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Seit Mitternacht schweigen nun an allen Fronten die Waffen. Auf Befehl des Großadmirals hat die Wehrmacht den aussichtslos gewordenen Kampf eingestellt.
But for some people, the defeat had come too late. For 6 years, Remagen Commandant Hans Scheller had been at war. 8 weeks before the peace, he was executed. His family survived.
Ich war schon ganz froh, dass jetzt Ruhe war, dass nichts mehr passieren konnte. Dass die Kinder und ich in Sicherheit waren. Das war wichtig. Denn vorher hieß es ja immer, nicht durch die Sippenhaft, die ja damals bestand, hätten sie mich mit den Kindern ja auch abholen können. Und das war damit vorbei.
The bridge at Remagen remains a symbol of victory over Hitler's Reich. But if the bridge itself was taken at little cost, the same could not be said of the rest of Europe. It had been a long and grueling march from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine. The end of the war brought liberation not only for the oppressed and the defeated, but also for the victors.
It's very curious to wake up in the morning and feel no fear. It was sort of inherent in you, this feeling of fear, which was part of being in active operations. I think you always had it. You weren't aware of it until it went. And then it was like a great load being lifted.
In the end, there were no winners and no losers. Simply liberated people, delivered from the horrors of war. The Battle of the Rhine had initiated the last act of a war that defaced a continent and killed tens of millions. Hitler's downfall liberated not only Europe from the Nazi yoke, but the defeated German people too, whose country had been laid waste in the struggle for freedom.